Welcome to Whalefest. Thank you for being here. My name is Dan Hafley. I'm a member of the board of Monterey Bay National Marine Sanctuary Foundation, one of the sponsors of today's event. And another sponsor is Marine Life Studies, which is involved in whale disentanglement. It's called the Whale Entanglement Team. And Peggy Stapp was due to be here to discuss this. Unfortunately, she is out with her boat and her team chasing an entangled whale. So they will not be here today, but we have a great speaker who will be our early afternoon speaker. Before I get to his introduction, I just want to note that Whalefest is a community event that happens every year. You can support Whalefest. If you head back out towards the wharf, there's a booth that says volunteer check-in, and next to that is a booth where they're selling things such as some really cool bags and t-shirts for Whalefest. If you purchase one of those, you can support Whalefest. It's actually a donation to Whalefest, and you can receive those as gifts as a result of your donation. And also whalefest.org, supporting their efforts would be much appreciated. So I'd like to thank our afternoon speaker for coming. Peter Adame is the Sustainability Director for Lusa America Foods and Monterey Bay Seafood, a major West Coast seafood wholesaler, processor, and distributor. Peter spent several years collaborating with the Global Seafood Ratings Alliance, which is a very big deal in the area of looking at different types of seafood and what's appropriate to eat and not eat if we want to support the web of life in the ocean. He is the former outreach manager for Monterey Bay Aquarium Seafood Watch Program. Outside of work, he volunteers with the Surfrider Foundation, which is a great organization, leading the Monterey County chapter's ocean-friendly restaurant program, which is really appropriate given his background, all volunteer effort. And he's also a site host for community-supported fishery. So he's very active in the community in many ways. He's an expert in different types of seafood in the ratings program, and I'd like to ask you to please give a warm welcome to Peter Adame.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. As you mentioned, I'm not Peggy, so sorry to disappoint if anyone was here to learn about whale entanglements. How fitting that Peggy is being called to go save a whale. I mean, that's awful, but also how appropriate for Whalefest. That's so, shout out to Peggy for all of her hard work. So thank you for the introduction. My name's Peter, and I'm gonna be here digging in on sustainable seafood. What does that mean? How is it used? I kind of have a unique experience of working on the environmental side of things for a while, and now I'm on the industry side. And I've already found it fascinating to kind of see maybe what some of the disconnects are, where we can make improvement, and then I'll wrap up with what we can all do as everyday consumers. So to kick us off, I personally love seafood. Can I hear, what's your favorite type of seafood? You can just shout it out. Sushi. Sashimi. Lobster. Salmon. Salmon's very popular, for sure. Cod. Nice. Love it. So I grew up on the East Coast. I'm from Virginia, the DC area. And I grew up eating blue crab, and it was a vessel to eat melted butter, right? And then I moved out to the West Coast and learned about Dungeness crab, so much more meat, so much less work. And never did I imagine I would go down this very niche path of sustainable seafood. My background's in communications, and I did a lot of promotional work for a while. But I ended up getting a gig at the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Such an amazing place. And if you didn't know, where we're sitting right now is actually owned by the Monterey Bay Aquarium as well. And they were kind enough to donate this space for our symposium today. So I'm sure many of you are already familiar with the Monterey Bay Aquarium. Their mission is to inspire conservation of the ocean. And I was fortunate to work in their division of conservation and science for about 7 years. And the aquarium was doing to make a difference beyond just the aquarium exhibits, right? They focus on plastic pollution, climate change, protecting different wildlife. They do a ton of research when it comes to tuna, sea otters, and white sharks. And they also, as many of you probably know, focus on fisheries and aquaculture. And so you might already be familiar with Seafood Watch. They do a sustainable seafood program. The Monterey Bay Aquarium started this in 1999 because they were showing people about what are all the issues impacting our ocean and issues on overfishing and bycatch. And so they realized we have a cafe at our aquarium as well. We need to make sure we are walking the talk. And so they had a science team that's small at first that started to research how are the fish populations doing? What is sustainable seafood? The word started to come to light, but it wasn't really defined, and it really isn't the best defined today. I'm going to help define it for us in what we see from the conservation community and how we evaluate it. But they make now these Seafood Watch guides. And so at first, at the cafe, they had these miniature versions, and they started to disappear from the tables. People started to take them, and they realized that there was this cry for information, for guidance. The aquarium, you're showing us the issue, but now what's the answer? And so that's how the Seafood Watch program was born. I already lost my clicker. Okay. For those that don't know, the Seafood Watch program, it's basic, kind of like a traffic light system, green, yellow, red rating system. So the researchers do all of this research on the sustainability, the environmental sustainability of different species, and it gets a numerical score that then translates to a green, yellow, or red rating. So red's going to be your avoid list. This is species that aren't doing so well. Either the population's not doing well, or it's being caught or farmed in ways that have a very negative impact on our environment or other marine life. Yellow is the good alternative list. That name, good alternative, it's a little misleading at times because it's yellow for a reason. There are still some concerns with that category. And then green is going to be the best choice list. And so Monterey Bay Aquarium's been working in this space forever. They pass out a ton of these consumer guides. I hear they had a really good outreach manager that got the word out. But it is a real issue. I think a common question I got when I worked at the aquarium was, you're an aquarium, why are you talking about eating seafood? That seems, that doesn't make sense. That's, why are you doing that? And I think it's because the aquarium's very good about taking a step back and looking at the big picture, right? Because yes, they are very concerned about marine life, but they're also very concerned about climate change. And if you have dug into the climate issue, you know that the meat industry is a huge contributor to that, whereas seafood tends to have a very low carbon footprint compared to other land-based proteins. Not to mention, seafood provides billions of jobs around the world, especially people's livelihoods in island nations and coastal communities. But it's also very healthy and nutritious. And it's something that dietitians across America agree Americans could be eating more and should be eating more because it's packed full of omega-3s that are important for us, for our cardiovascular health, for our brain health. Back to sustainability. The Atlantic cod fishery tends to be that classic example, right? I mean, if you were a fisherman back in the day, it was during the Industrial Revolution. All of a sudden, we got better at fishing farther offshore. We got better technology, sonar, radar, hydraulics to get more fish out of the ocean. And you were probably on cloud 9 for a while because there's plenty of fish in the sea. But the reality is that's not the truth. And our natural resources do have a limit. And we've experienced that firsthand in a lot of different scenarios, one of them being the Atlantic cod fishery. This is a quick graph of the biomass of table fish, so a lot of different whitefish, pollocks, cods. And you can see, if I fast forward here, let me see if I'll be able to go back, what kind of change we're seeing in our lifetime. It's pretty crazy. And, you know, too many boats, too few fish. Another big concern is bycatch. I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir a little bit, but it has an impact on other species. The reason why Peggy is not here right now is because a whale is entangled in fishing gear. And that is a common problem in different types of commercial fishing methods. But every method is different. We can't just say the seafood industry is bad, we need to stop all fishing. That is not a realistic approach. It's a sight we don't like to see, but it is today's reality. And so that's why the seafood industry can work as a whole to improve our practices, to reduce bycatch, to improve management. We've been talking about seafood, and a lot of people think of wild seafood, but that's just half of the picture. Did you know today over half of the seafood we consume in America is farmed? Farmed seafood, also known as aquaculture, so farming on land is agriculture, farming in the water is aquaculture, is a whole nother scope, a whole nother list of opportunities and issues. And it's something we have to move towards. If you're someone that has said, oh, I only eat wild seafood, you can do that for a while, but I'm here to tell you it's actually not a sustainable option, and that our planet cannot keep up. Our ocean has hit its limit, and we are starting to see the orange you see tapers off, it is flat. We are catching the same amount of fish out of the ocean pretty much every year, and that is not growing at this point until we have more sustainable management involved that's set up to help those species grow. And so that's why we want to work towards science-based management with our fisheries. You'll see the blue is aquaculture. It's the fastest growing sector of the commercial food industry. Aquaculture is the fastest growing sector of the commercial food industry. So there's a lot of opportunity right now to make sure that it's done right for the future. So we talked about, there's two big camps, wild seafood and farm seafood. Now I want to talk a little bit about how do scientists really evaluate sustainable seafood. So with wild seafood, there's 4 key criteria that scientists are going to look at. They're going to look at, okay, that target species that we're talking about, how are the populations doing? We're going to look at impacts on other species, right? Bycatch, we talked about that earlier. Management, and it is a really big one. What kind of regulations are in place? Are they being enforced? And then habitat ecosystems as well. That can be impacts from the actual fishing gear, or it can be how important is that target species to other species in its ecosystem. I'm not going to dig into every one of these farm seafood criteria, but this is what the Seafood Watch team looks at. So they have a team here at the aquarium that focus on fisheries, and then there's another team that focuses on aquaculture, farm seafood. And so they're looking at, okay, with farm seafood, where's the farm located? What's the waste from the farm? Are there issues with disease? I mean, even farming a lot of land-based animals in a contained area tends to be a recipe for disease. And if you're having disease issues at a farm because of all the waste, because of the feed, are you using antibiotics then to keep your fish alive? I mean, you have to keep your fish alive, but then all of a sudden we're introducing antibiotics into the animals that we will be eating. And how does that create antibiotic resistance for us? One thing I had never thought about was escapes. What's the big deal if a farmed fish escapes? I mean, more food for the killer whales, right, I would think. But no, it depends on where you're located, what the species is. You have some scenarios, like in New Zealand, where they farm salmon, and it's rated a green best choice. They do a really good job of management. There's really good water flow there, so there aren't really issues with disease, so they don't need any antibiotics. And there aren't issues with escapes there either, because they actually release the same farmed fish into those rivers, into those waterways to promote recreational fishing. Whereas perhaps if you're on the West Coast and you're farming Atlantic salmon, farmed fish are dumb fish. They have been raised in captivity their whole lives. They don't have the genes, the traits, the brains to survive. So when those species mix, it can be an issue because it's actually dumbing down the gene pool. Something I never thought about before. So our scientists take all of those into consideration when creating these green, yellow, red ratings. These are all available on seafoodwatch.org, and it's great because you can segment it depending on the species. If you can figure out if it's farmed or wild, it'll narrow down your search results. But there's also eco-certifications. So these are another kind of tool that consumers can use, right? If you're out shopping at a retailer, you can look for different check marks. The one at the bottom is probably going to be your most popular one, the Marine Stewardship Council, MSC. It's a blue check mark. You can look for that if you're shopping. You'll know that they did a benchmarking study to figure out where it landed on Seafood Watch ratings, and it's either a yellow or better. So it's equivalent to a good alternative. It's recommended. These are the eco-certifications that are recognized by Seafood Watch. Granted, anybody can say on a label that their food's sustainable. There is no regulations around that right now. And so that's where these third-party eco-certifications can come into play. Now, it's interesting because you do get into maybe some socioeconomic challenges where with these guys, someone is paying for them. Someone has to pay for it. It's an audit, essentially. And so that's kind of the trade-off. We're seeing a lot of eco-certification happening, and it's a great tool and support system, right, for the sustainable seafood movement, but it isn't necessarily the answer for everyone. And I say that because most of the fisheries that are certified are in North America, Europe, countries that can afford it. A lot of our seafood comes from Latin America, Southeast Asia, and sometimes this isn't always an option. So that's where Seafood Watch comes into play, because they are basically researching fisheries and farms, whether people like it or not. They don't cost anything. And now they're really collaborating well with these certifications, where they have the certifications and ratings collaboration. And Seafood Watch says, we don't need to duplicate work. If you've already certified these fisheries, there's no need for us to focus on that. We'll go ahead and defer to your certification. We'll focus on other parts of the world, different species that don't have information, so that we, consumers, so that chefs, retailers can know what to buy and what is science-based sustainable seafood. At this point, the Monterey Bay Aquarium has about 85% of the US seafood market covered. So there are ratings for most products out there. 65 to 90% of our seafood here in the United States is imported. 65 to 90%. Most people run with the 90% statistic. 65 it depends on if it's been processed in another country or not, and that can get a little complex. But I go back to even management being one of the key criterion that we look at, and that's because not all countries are managing seafood the same, and so that can really be a big player in the sustainability, because so much of our seafood is imported. It's a very complex chain. It's usually processed multiple times at different facilities, so it can be hard, and that's where you hear issues around traceability issues, right? Or maybe seafood fraud, because it's so easy for stuff to get mixed up along the way. This is a global issue, and so we're working globally. The aquarium started the Global Seafood Ratings Alliance, which is a fascinating group. So Seafood Watch focuses here on North America, but we were curious, what other groups are out there doing the same work in their own countries? And so this is when we started the Global Seafood Ratings Alliance, and it's been so cool to see all these different groups working towards the same mission, and we're able to compare our environmental standards, agree on what is needed for environmental sustainability. So we have Marviva in Latin America, the Marine Conservation Society in the UK, Mr. Goodfish in France. Really fun network. But all of us kind of have the same vision and the same theory of change. So we really want consumers to play their part on voicing these issues to businesses. I hate asking that question. It can feel uncomfortable. If you're comfortable doing it, go for it. A lot of times I like to ask, do you know where this is from? Even if they don't know, it's kind of encouraging at least the waiter or waitress to realize, oh, wow, I didn't realize our salmon's coming from Norway, or our shrimp is, from the Philippines, right? We kind of assume everything's local, but it typically is not. So when consumers voice these issues, that's where we're seeing businesses committing now. So businesses are committing to corporate social responsibility or some kind of sustainable seafood standard, right? And when we see businesses committing to maybe only buying green and yellow rated or eco-certified products, then that's where suppliers have to respond, right? Then there's that market pressure. We go back to this U.S. importing so much seafood. There's pros and cons to that. Obviously, it's not good that we import that much, but it means we have a big say in what we allow into our marketplace. And so as major retailers and food service companies are committing to this, it does have a global effect. And ultimately, the goal is to see improvements in fisheries and aquaculture. I love this illustration. This is what a fish market used to look like. I don't know when, but a lot of different species here, right? Back in the day when they went to the fish market, they didn't know what they were going to get. It's a pretty different picture. You go to any grocery store, any time of year, in any state in the United States, you're going to see the same products. And so a lot of that also shows that we should diversify, try new species, figure out what is local in your community. And we're here in Monterey Bay. We're so fortunate to have access to West Coast groundfish, to rockfish, also known as rock cod, black cod, also known as sablefish, petrale sole, Dover sole, lingcod, Dungeness crab. We have all of these other options, and I think we can do a better job of supporting our local U.S. fisheries. Shrimp is the #1 product here in the United States, and a lot of people don't realize 80% of it is farmed in Southeast Asia. Now, I don't want to say this is necessarily a bad thing. It's just, it's interesting that our U.S. demand has this global effect. So this is a video one of our scientists took flying over. This is in Myanmar, I believe. And it's interesting because we fly over the United States and you see all these patches of green, right? All these patches. It's the same thing there, only these are shrimp ponds. These are shrimp farms. All of those are shrimp farms. It's the #1 industry for a lot of countries in Southeast Asia. And as you can imagine, in poorer countries, they don't necessarily have the regulations, the management, the enforcement. And so that's where we see a lot of issues where these are poor farmers just trying to make a living, take care of their family, buy school books for their kids. And so they're packing as many shrimp as they can into these ponds to feed the U.S. market. But that's where we see issues with antibiotic use and disease. And a lot of times these are not being the effluent, the waste from the farm is going straight into the ocean. And so I know the Monterey Bay Aquarium is doing a lot of work in that region and a lot of other environmental groups to help improve it, because we realize, hey, if this is the U.S. #1 product and a lot of it is red rated, this is an obvious area where we can all work together to make improvements. And we are starting to see a lot of changes there, where more farms are getting BAP certified, for example. That's best aquaculture practices. And they actually have a star level where you can make improvements along that journey. This is a photo of my old boss, Margaret Spring and Julie Packard from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and Jen Kemmerly. They do a lot of work, wonderful work around the world to this day, and do a lot with former Secretary of State John Kerry. But I also just want to talk about some of the great options. We've already talked about local species that we can all enjoy more, right? Rockfish, black cod, sole. But Arctic char is another one, if you've never had it. It's very similar to salmon. Bivalves are great. So clams, mussels, oysters, scallops, those are typically always green rated. by Seafood Watch. They're super sustainable. And that's because all they require is raw seawater. They are filter feeders, and they can actually have a positive impact on the environment. So if you love those species, definitely enjoy them. If oysters terrify you and you think it looks disgusting, maybe consider it one more time to give it a try. I want to talk about a story because, you know, working on the environmental side for so long, you kind of start to, you know, only think a certain way. But I want to introduce you to Fernando and Anna. They're from Portugal. And they are the founders of the company I work for now. So I now work for a seafood wholesaler, processor, and distributor. I've gone to the dark side. But arguably, I feel like I can make more change now. I am their sustainability director, and so I can work directly with our buyers on what we are getting and to help our customers meet our sustainability goals. And so Fernando and Anna are first generation here in the US. They're from Portugal. And for any history buffs, you might know that before Portugal was Portugal, it was Lusitania, and they were known as the Lusos. And so when Fernando and Anna emigrated to California and wanted to start a specialty foods company, they came up with the name Luz America because they wanted it to reflect the blending of cultures of this Portuguese family now starting their journey in America. So that's where the name Luz America comes from. And I'm very excited that we're doing a lot more local seafood. Some of you might have seen vans or trucks driving around if you live in the area that say Monterey Bay Seafood. That's our brand. So Monterey Bay Seafood is Luz America Foods. It's one of the brands that we work with. And I love it because I joined at such an exciting time where this company is a big seafood wholesaler, processor, distributor. We do the whole West Coast. We do some of America's largest retailers. If you brainstorm, you know, your top 5 grocery stores here in Monterey, we work with 2 of them. We also work with a lot of food service companies and everyday smaller restaurants as well. But I'm also excited that we're investing in the local seafood economy. And so Moss Landing Harbor used to be a very hardworking harbor for fisheries, for seafood, groundfish. Groundfish used to be the staple here on the West Coast. And so when I say groundfish, it's kind of the catch-all term for the local fish here on the West Coast that live along the ground. You might also hear them called bottom fish, bottom-dwelling fish. And that is, again, rockfish, also known as rock cod, which is those 2 on the right. We have black cod. Here's the second one here, also known as sablefish, also known as butterfish, one of my favorites. And then we also have sole, kind of similar to a halibut, a flatfish. We have petrale sole, Dover sole. And so we're now leasing a dock at Moss Landing Harbor, and we're trying to invest more in our local seafood economy because we actually have been getting groundfish for years, but it's all been from Canada, and it doesn't make sense. We want to support our local seafood economy. And so we also have some office space right there in the background of that boat. We're leasing a dock there. And it's interesting because, I don't know, things are always complicated. We are seen as the big bad company coming in to some people. You know, there's the local fishermen that have been here forever, or this big company coming in. And so I try to explain to those fishermen, you always want a buyer. And if there's someone that can come in and always be a consistent buyer of your products, that's a good thing. And we're also fortunate to be big enough that we can invest in infrastructure, which is a big challenge for a lot of the docks across the West Coast of the United States that are losing their fishermen because it's complex. We argue for such strict science-based management, right? Fishing quotas, 100% observer coverage for the West Coast groundfish fisheries. So that means now the fisherman has to pay for an extra crew member to just observe, and that comes out of the fisherman's pocket. They have quota systems, so they can only do, seasonal closures. Obviously, there's benefits to it, but there's also the hardships behind those. And especially when I mention again that the U.S. market imports so much, our local fishermen are competing against cheaper foreign exports. So try to support these local fishermen when you can. Try these local species. This is just our Fernando and Anna now. They started this company over 50 years ago, and it's still a family-owned and operated company. Those are some of the brands we work with. We do the whole West Coast. I'm sorry, I was pulling this PowerPoint presentation together a bit last minute, so sorry if it's a little salesy. But we do all types of seafood. We have over 100 species. We do a lot of value-added products. But I'm also excited to be managing their sustainability initiatives now, too. So we use Seafood Watch recommendations. We partner with other groups. We have a variety of eco-certification programs we work with. Fair trade is kind of a cool one. A lot of people know fair trade, from the coffee or chocolate, and they're trying to expand more in seafood. And so we're excited to be collaborating with them more. I want to leave time for questions, so I'm going to breeze through this a little bit, but we also work with the Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions. We aren't alone in this space. There's a whole network of nonprofits, and we're trying to align a little bit more, because the reality is when these large retailers commit to sustainable seafood, it's a lot of data collection. So, maybe a big grocery store bought 7,000 different items in the past quarter. Okay, well, to figure out if it's sustainable, that means we need to know the species, the scientific name, the FAO area, the management zone, the fishing or farming method, any eco-certifications that are involved, and if so, what are those certification codes? Is it part of a fishery improvement project? It has to be then registered on Fishery Progress. A lot of data. But it's cool to now be in a spot where I'm seeing Seafood Watch recommendations being put to light. And it's not always easy, because they do change from time to time. Seafood Watch tends to update their ratings every 4 to 5 years when new research comes out, sometimes sooner if there's a big event or study. But for example, we used to get a lot of our Atlantic salmon from Canada, from British Columbia, and that recently was downgraded to red. And so all of a sudden, we had to pivot. And for one of the retailers we're working with, their goal is by the end of 2022, their top 20 seafood items need to be sustainable, need to be green or yellow rated or eco-certified. And one thing I think I've seen that's kind of a relief after experiencing working on both the environmental side and the industry side is that major retailers and food service companies, for the most part, are doing a lot of good work. I'm relieved that there's always room for improvement, keep pushing them. And does not apply for all of them, but I'm very thankful that the retailers we work with have really good strategies in place. And it tends to be these larger businesses that can afford having a sustainability team, that can afford to spend the time doing this. Whereas smaller mom and pop restaurants, I want to definitely support local business, but the trade-off is they're just trying to survive. They aren't necessarily prioritizing sustainability. Usually it's more price-driven. That's not always the case. There's a lot of champions out there, local businesses. But I also kind of step back and I'm kind of relieved, because I'm we can keep supporting small businesses, because at the end of the day, it's these big retailers that can drive change internationally, right? If your largest grocery store chain in your area stops buying a product because it's red rated and is opting for the same product, a lot of times it just is from a different country, right? Because it's back to that management zone, or maybe the populations are doing better in a different area. We haven't even dug into human rights issues. That's a whole nother presentation. And at the end of the day, you should eat more seafood, low carbon footprint. It can be very sustainable. But unfortunately, there are a lot of issues still in the seafood industry, because once you get 200 miles offshore, it is the high seas and there is no regulations. And so especially in Southeast Asia, we see migrant workers that are just looking for a job, are convinced, hey, here's the job as a fisherman, get on this boat. It's called transshipment. So that boat might be out at sea for 2 years, So it's a stark reality a little bit more in the seafood industry. I think we tend to really dig into it with garments, right? Clothing industry is really digging into it. And it's something the environmental seafood movement has definitely been addressing a lot more. It's a lot more top of mind for us, and it's in sync. If you're going to have sustainability, yes, environmental sustainability is important, but you also need economical sustainability and social sustainability, right? So making sure that we're taking care of our neighbors, taking care of people, paying them properly, giving them fair wages. And there's a lot of resources out there, thankfully, from groups like Fishwise is up in Santa Cruz. They do a ton of great work in this space. We already saw that slide. Just kind of some takeaways. Now I work with the Surfrider. I volunteer with the Surfrider Foundation, and I am part of their ocean-friendly restaurant program. So now shifting slightly from sustainable seafood to plastics, which is, of course, a whole nother presentation as well. The ocean-friendly restaurant program is great because we work with restaurants. Hopefully I have a list somewhere. Here we go. We're working with restaurants in the community to phase out their single-use plastics. So businesses that sign up, again, it's free to join. We're just relaunching it, so our list is a little shy right now. But we're hoping to expand that tremendously, and we could use your help too if you know of any businesses in the area that really care about these issues, or just communicate, no, I don't want this plastic bag. You should consider doing a paper bag instead. You can look into Surfrider's ocean-friendly restaurant program. And so with this program, restaurants are committed to no plastic straws, no plastic bags, no plastic water bottles, no styrofoam, only reusable dine-and-ware, proper recycling in place. And so we're very appreciative for some of our new businesses that we're working with, including Alvarado Street Brewing, Passion Fish, The Salty Seal, Manapua Wine Bar, Zab Zab Thai, Pacific Bowls and Rolls, and The Pocket. Swing by our booth. We have a booth here at Whalefest, Surfrider Foundation. For those that aren't familiar with us, we were started in the 80s by a group of surfers, and now we're the largest grassroots network of volunteers and coastal defenders. So there's over 80 chapters across the United States, here on the West Coast, East Coast, Great Lakes. And we have a lot of different programs we work on. We're all volunteers for the most part. However, we do have a headquarters with about 50 paid staff, and a lot of those are policy analysts that will help us lobby for new regulations or management to help reduce plastics in our community, to protect our beaches, to ensure coastal access. And I invite you all to also come to one of our beach cleanups. We do a beach cleanup every fourth Sunday at 10 a.m. No registration needed. Don't need to bring anything. Just show up, have a nice walk on the beach with us, and we'll provide some supplies, and you can participate in our beach cleanup. I think I'll leave this slide up, and if you guys have any questions, or do I need to end there? 15 minutes for questions. I'd love questions if you guys have any. I know I covered a lot in that presentation. Yeah?
Anybody have any questions?
Yes.
I have actually a question about the shrimp fishery.
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of it used to come up from the Gulf Coast.
Mm-hmm.
So why did the percentages change? Just the quality of the consumption, or what was the other?
Well, I think that's where it gets back to the balance of environmental sustainability, economical sustainability. So a lot of our U.S. fisheries, in general, if you can support U.S. seafood, go for it. If it's from the U.S., we have very strict regulations and management here, and so for the most part, it's going to be a good option. It's going to be from the Gulf or from Washington or California, Oregon, right? And so to answer your question, I mean, it's mostly just price. Shrimp from Southeast Asia is farmed in mass quantities, and it's a lot cheaper. And we can freeze it and send it across the world. And so it might even be a fun little test for you. If you go out to eat, or no, just go to the grocery store, try to find U.S. shrimp. It will be harder to do than you will realize. So definitely support our U.S. fisheries when you can. Great question. Any other questions? Yes.
Question about fish quotas. Are they, how do you feel about fish quotas being like science-based?
That's a great question. So she was asking about fish quotas and if I think they're a good option. So earlier in this presentation, we talked about the Atlantic cod fishery and how it collapsed. The Atlantic cod fishery on the U.S. has still not replenished itself. And we experienced this with groundfish. So groundfish, I kind of hinted a little bit, it was the staple fishery here on the West Coast. It is what people ate. It's what fishermen caught. And then, sure enough, it was overfished. They were using bottom trawls. They were catching a ton of fish. And it collapsed in 2000. That's not long ago. And when the fishery collapsed, scientists, came together, management, regulators, to come up with a plan on how we're going to get this fishery to bounce back. They estimated it would take about 70 to 80 years to recover. It took 14. Science-based management works, and we have such a cool example right here in our backyard. 14 years instead of 70, 80. They actually have now dialed back the quotas because they're realizing how efficient it is, how it's working. They're constantly monitoring the fish populations. And so I definitely advocate that it's a great option. And science-based management in general is something we should always be pushing for, right? And so I also kind of want to note, bottom trawls, those are big nets that drag across the seafloor, right? Super bad. Not always. Yes, for the most part, but not always. When they are regulated properly, we need high volume fisheries to feed America. And, again, it's kind of even back to my experience here working in Moss Landing. We work with a lot of small little boats that are great fishermen, but they cannot supply enough to meet our customers that are big retailers. And I think it's great that the Monterey Bay Fisheries Trust is a really great group that supports the local seafood community, and they've been doing a lot to push farmers markets and buying off the boat. Do that if you can, but it's expensive. And so if we are gonna have seafood that people are actually gonna buy, it has to be high volume, it has to be affordable. And so bottom trawls have this negative connotation now where, oh, it's awful, you'd never want to do it. Yes, there are very sensitive parts of our ocean and seafloor, but not all of it. A lot of it is just mud. It's deserts. There are deserts in the ocean. And so that's where the management has been really good. And that's been, yes, the fishing quotas, right? So now the fishermen can only catch so much of each species, and they can actually sell the quota to other fishermen if, all of a sudden they catch maybe too much or something and they're realizing, oh, I want to keep fishing for less. They could buy a quota from a different fisherman, or they can sell their quota. Oh, I'm not catching any black cod for some reason. I'm only catching rockfish. They can sell their quota, right? But it's a way to ensure that we're not overfishing. And then we have the management zones, right? So they can only trawl in certain areas. And now we also have the 100% observer coverage, which is really great. I mean, that's a pretty rare thing to have 100% observer coverage. That goes back to there is someone on the boat that is monitoring everything, regulating what are they catching, what's the bycatch. At the dock, too, there's also an observer that verifies everything to make sure stuff isn't slipping through the cracks, that people are being honest. And we really only see that in, I think Alaska's pretty good about it. Alaska has really good regulations and management in place. But it's arguably one of the most heavily regulated fisheries in the world at this point. And I think it's just such a cool success story, a conservation success story. So again, rockfish, also known as rock cod, black cod, also known as sablefish, petrale sole, Dover sole, lingcod. Have any of you, raise your hand if you've tried those species. Good. I love to see it. So we can all be eating those more for sure. I mean, I love my salmon too. It's okay. Eat seafood. But you can also be diversifying what you're eating. Any other questions? Yes.
In terms of sustainability, sorry we missed a few minutes.
No problem.
But in terms of sustainability, there are companies now that are making alternate fish protein from fermentation or plant-based.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the carbon equation is definitely different for seafood compared to plant-based animal protein. So, how does that fit in for sustainability of seafood, or does it even make a dent?
That's a great question. Do we have any vegetarians in the room? Thanks for putting up with this presentation on seafood. But we can also support our sea veggies. So seaweed is super sustainable. It's kind of like bivalves, where it actually can make the ecosystem healthier because it's pulling nutrients out of the water that come from our land-based waste. So definitely support eating your sea veggies, and seaweed is green rated. And to your point, I guess, about plant-based seafood, I think it's a good alternative. I think it scares the seafood industry because they're like, no, it's a competing product. But I think it's definitely something that we should all incorporate into our portfolio. I mean, I used to be the biggest red meat eater. I love prime rib rare. Thanks, Mom. We bonded over that. But I've cut back my red meat consumption tremendously. Probably because I live in California now and I'm exposed to oh my gosh, all these issues and climate change, and who knew that how much beef is contributing to, the big problem facing today's planet. And it's little changes, right? And I think it can be complicated too, especially when there's cultural changes, right? I mean, I thought it was really interesting. I've worked with the Global Seafood Ratings Alliance I mentioned earlier, and one of my counterparts in Japan, Japan. They have to take the approach a little differently. If they red rate stuff in their own country, they're going to get shut down. So they're like, please, you guys, you outside groups can continue to do that, but we have to be a little bit more. And interestingly, nonprofits aren't really as respected there. And so for them, the business we work with isn't a nonprofit. It's technically a business. And so kind of a little different cultural shifts, right? It's not like there's a one-size-fits-all answer to everything, right? You need to adapt depending on where you are and what the challenges are in that region, and be sensitive to cultural norms, right, and traditions. Any other questions? Yes.
You talked about human rights abuses. How are they being incorporated into sustainability?
That's a great question. So she was asking, how are human rights issues being incorporated into sustainability? I think as a whole, the environmental movement now is just embracing it so much. And so I had mentioned that Conservation Alliance for Seafood Solutions, and that used to be completely environmental focused, like when it started. And now, I think it was probably 2014 when all these issues broke out of slavery in Thailand on all of these boats. This big story broke out in the media, and it's seafood caught by slaves in Thailand, and it's making its way to U.S. markets and sold at our everyday grocery stores, and it really shook the industry. And of course, a lot of businesses immediately were reacting where they're like, we just don't want that bad press, right? We can't have that in our supply chain, right? Seafood is complex for sure. And so a lot of it now is trying to understand the supply chain, getting clarity and transparency and traceability incorporated into the supply chain. And so that's kind of also like when I mentioned it's a lot of data collection. And you can set up different protocols potentially, right? So For example, you can have audits at actual producers, right? They might have to get audited regularly. I know some retailers require that. And there's different signs you can look for that tend to be red flags. So for example, with tuna tends to be a tough one. They're at sea for long periods of time. And so they'll look at, okay, how long, maybe there's a limit. They will only allow boats, they only buy from boats that are out for, not longer than this period, right? So at least you're guaranteeing that the crew is coming back to land. You can have even basic things like communications opportunities for your workers, so requiring that there's a hotline potentially posted around the facilities, whether it's a processing plant or an import or warehouse, right? Making sure that workers have a voice is a big one, right? Giving them the opportunity to communicate. And I feel like it's funny shouldn't be the word, but we've been working in this space and we're like, yes, we need grievance mechanisms is the word that's used a lot in the environmental space and with scientists. Yes, we need grievance mechanisms so workers can have an opportunity to communicate and share if they're being mistreated. Well, it turns out people don't like the word grievance mechanisms, and people are less likely to actually call that number because they don't really understand it, or they wouldn't want to call it. And I think there were even examples like here in the U.S. where they tried it, and I think someone just like stopped and looked at it, and they're like, if I was actually getting treated poorly, I don't know if that's who I would call. I don't know. So definitely room for improvement. And I know Seafood Watch, for example, they are developing a seafood slavery risk tool. With our science-based ratings, we can ask for the information, but you can't really say, hey, how many slaves do you have back there? So it's all in the dark, right? And one thing they talk about is you want to bring the issue to light. And it's not the same necessarily with environmental, where if you find it in your supply chain, stop buying from it. We actually say stay engaged, because if you just stop buying from that company, the problem's still going to be there, and you're still going to have issues with seafood slavery. But if you can engage with the company, use your economic buying power to keep them engaged, right? I mean, thankfully, if we're a U.S. company, a lot of times we are larger and tend to buy a lot of product. So if you can work with the company to address those issues, that's going to be a better option. Good question. Thank you guys for putting up with me.